Good evening. I trust you had a fruitful day. I do not say happy, though I hope it has been happy. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the Buddha, the blessed, noble, and fully self-awakened one. So this evening, we're moving to another character called Potiliya. This is Majjhima Nikaya number 54. So again, we have a very well-known scene. The Blessed One has taken his outer robe. He's gone to the local capital, Apana. This is in the Anguttarapa country, which I think is south of the Ganges, not sure. And he then went to a certain grove. So we don't know the name of this particular grove. Having entered the grove, he sat down at the root of a tree. Now, Potiliya, a householder, was walking and wandering for exercise, wearing full dress with parasol and sandals. He also went to the grove and went to the Blessed One, exchanged greetings with him. There are seats, householder. Sit down as you like, said the Blessed One. And the householder thought, this recluse Gautama addresses me as a householder. And he was angry and displeased and remained silent. So the Buddha again invited him, please, householder, sit as you would like, and the third time. And then the third time when he said, sit down as you like, Potiliya was still displeased because he was being addressed as a householder. And so he said, Master Gautama, it is neither fitting nor proper that you address me as a householder. A householder, you have all the aspects, the marks and signs of a householder. After all, he's walking and wandering for exercise, wearing full dress with parasol and sandals. Nevertheless, Master Gautama, I have given up all my works and cut off my affairs. So here, we have to remember, whenever you get this word householder, we're talking about people who are still caught up in the sensual life, who aren't really practicing spiritually. Which means following the Buddha, right? They may be following other leaders, but the Buddha may not recognize that as a truly spiritual life. I don't know. So you always get this word bhikkhu, which refers to anybody who's following the spiritual life, according to the Buddha, and a householder who isn't. So this Potiliya is a little bit annoyed that he's been called a householder when he's given up everything, you see. And in what way, asked the Buddha, have you given up all your works, householder, cut off all your affairs? Master Gautama, I've given up my wealth, grain, silver, and gold, so he's a rich fellow, to my children as their inheritance. Without advising or admonishing them, I live merely on food and clothing. This is how I've given up my works and cut off all my affairs. So on the outer, looking at it from a particular angle, he's now just living on food and clothing, just like anybody who has gone out and left the household life and become a samana. So a samana is an ascetic, a wanderer. So the Buddha replies, as you describe it is one thing, but in the noble one's discipline, that's his own discipline, the cutting off of affairs is different. What is the cutting off of affairs like in the noble one's dispensation, Venerable Sir? It'd be good to know this. So listen carefully, householder. Yes, Venerable Sir. So he's got a bit more humble, I think. So there are 8 things that lead to cutting off of affairs. So we can. These are the 8 abandonments. With the support of non-killing of living beings, the killing of living beings is abandoned. So this is a very roundabout way of saying, giving up killing living beings, you then have abandoned killing living beings. The scriptures have a sort of way of repeating themselves, remember, so they can be remembered. And this is true also of false speech, right? Giving up, abandoning false speech, abandoning malicious speech. So many of these we've come across, of course. Abandoning rapacious greed. I don't quite know why the word rapacious is put on greed, but it's obviously rapacious greed. So it's really heavy greed to the detriment of oneself and others, etc. Spiteful scolding, spiteful scolding. In the notes, it talks about violent reprisal. So that's a bit more than violent scolding. That's the commentaries. An angry despair. Angry despair is to be abandoned. It doesn't support why we should be angry and despair, or the despair of anger, or the anger of despair, whatever. With the support of, and without arrogance needs to be abandoned. So obviously this Potiliya, he has a little large dose of arrogance, walking around as if he were living the true spiritual life, when in fact he's actually quite comfortable. These are the 8 things stated in brief, which are to be expounded in detail, that lead to the cutting off of affairs. So we have, the usual non-killing, false speech, lying, malicious speech, rapacious greed, spiteful scolding, which is also can be violent, it seems, angry despair, and arrogance. I've missed one. Try again. The killing of living beings, taking what is not freely given, false speech, yes, taking what is not freely given, false speech, malicious speech, rapacious greed, spiteful scolding, angry despair, and arrogance. So these are the 8 abandonments. So now Potiliya wants him to expound on these, right? So he says, here a noble disciple considers this: I am practicing the way to the abandoning and cutting off of those fetters, because of which I might kill living beings. If I were to kill living beings, so these are reflections that one has if one were to do these unwholesome actions. If I were to kill living beings, I would blame myself for doing so. The wise, having investigated, would censure me for doing so. On the dissolution of the body after death, because of killing living beings, an unhappy destination could be expected, would be expected. And the killing of living beings itself is a fetter and a hindrance. So the fetter, in other words, ties you back into this form of existence. And of course, in our meditation, turns up as a hindrance of self-blaming, of guilt, etc., etc. Okay, so these are the things. If we did these unwholesome acts, we behaved in this unwholesome way, well, then we would end up just blaming ourselves, feeling bad about ourselves. Shame. That's shame, isn't it? We'd have other people telling us how awful we were in doing so. On the dissolution of the body after death, we could end up in a very unhappy destination. And of course, it becomes a fetter for us, this killing, cutting us off from the awakening, you see. Although it's not an actual fetter, capital F, it still remains as something that ties us down. And of course, a hindrance in our practice. And he says this, of course, for the rest of them, right? Which, remember, is taking what is not freely given, false speech, malicious speech, rapacious greed, spiteful scolding, and angry despair, and arrogance, of course, arrogance. Then, having said this, these 8 things that lead to the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's disciple have now been expounded in detail. But the cutting off of affairs in the Noble One's disciples has not been yet entirely and achieved entirely and in all ways. So this is what the Buddha says to him. Well, how is that done? How do you cut off everything so that you become fully liberated? So he says, listen. And then the Buddha gives 4 or 5, I think, different metaphors. So the Buddha loves to give metaphors. I think he would have been something like a scriptwriter or a novelist or something, because he's always having stated the thing in a sort of logical, rational way. He then loves to give these metaphors. So here's the first one. Suppose a dog, overcome by hunger and weakness, was waiting by a butcher's shop. Then a skilled butcher or apprentice would cut out the skeleton of meatless bones smeared with blood and toss it to the dog. What do you think, householder? Would that dog get rid of his hunger and weakness by gnawing such a skeleton of meatless bones smeared with blood? No, venerable sir. Eventually, that dog would reap weariness and disappointment. So there's the image of greed or whatever. And then he says, sensual pleasure is compared to the skeleton by the Blessed One, etc. And he, having seen this with proper wisdom, seen the problem with indulgence with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified based on diversity, and develops the equanimity that is unified based on unity. Now, equanimity that is diversified and based on diversity is that sort of boredom that comes up, or the sense of indifference, or a sense of apathy. Perhaps that's the best, a sense of apathy that comes up because things are no longer pleasing you. And the diversity, of course, is variety, right? Variety is the spice of life, but it also leads ultimately to this apathy, to this boredom. Whereas equanimity, which is unified, this is always the equanimity that comes with concentration. Here specifically, he's talking about these absorption states. But just in our practice, in ordinary daily life, we can experience an equanimous mind. And when it's equanimous, you're sure it's not clinging. So that's the point. Then he talks about a vulture or a crow or a hawk seized a piece of meat and flew away. Then vultures, crows, and hawks flew up and pecked and clawed it. What do you think, householder? If that vulture, crow, or hawk does not quickly let go of the piece of meat, wouldn't it incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Indeed, it would, you see. So the Blessed One said, well, they provide much suffering and much despair, while the danger in them is great. So this, of course, again, is sensual pleasures. Sensual pleasures is compared to a piece of meat. Then again, we have the blazing grass torch. And a man took a blazing grass torch and went against the wind. What do you think, householder? If that man does not quickly let go of that blazing grass torch, wouldn't that blazing grass torch burn his hand and his arm or some other parts of the body? He might incur death or deadly suffering because of that. Yes, indeed, venerable sir. So this is again sensual pleasure and the usual thing about suffering, much despair, etc. Then he's got the charcoal pit. This is a great one, this. Deeper than a man's height, full of glowing coals without flame or smoke. Then a man who wanted to live and not to die, who wanted pleasure and recoiled from pain. And two strong men seized him by both arms and dragged him towards the charcoal pit. What do you think, householder? Would that man not twist his body this way and that? Definitely, venerable sir, definitely, for he will incur death or deadly suffering because of that. So again, sensual pleasures is compared to a charcoal pit. Then there's this one, a man dreamt about lovely parks, lovely groves, lovely meadows, and lovely lakes, and on walking out, he saw nothing of it. So too, a noble disciple considers sensual pleasures have to be compared to a dream. They provide much suffering and much despair. So then another one, a man borrowed goods on loan, a fancy carriage, and fine jeweled earrings, and proceeded, and surrounded by these borrowed goods, he went to the market. Then people seeing him would say, sirs, this is a rich man. This is how the rich enjoy their wealth. Then the owners, when they saw him, would take their things back. What do you think, householder? Would that be enough for that man to become dejected, depressed? Definitely. This is the problem with sensual pleasure. Things are on loan. They don't belong to us. And then there's another one. Got quite a few actually. Suppose there was a dense grove not far from the village or town, within which there was a tree laden with fruit, but none of its fruit had fallen to the ground. Then a man came needing fruit, seeking fruit, wandering in search of fruit, and he entered the grove and saw the tree laden with fruit. And he thought to himself, this tree is laden with fruit, but as none has fallen to the ground, I know how to climb a tree. I shall climb the tree, eat as much fruit as I want, and fill my bag. And he did so. Then a second man, needing to seek fruit, much the same way, came with a sharp axe. This tree is laden with fruit, he thought to himself. I do not know how to climb, so I'll cut the tree down, eat as much as I want, and fill my bag. What do you think, householder? If that first man who had climbed the tree doesn't come down quickly when the tree falls, wouldn't he break a hand or a foot or some other part of the body so that he might incur death or deadly suffering because of that? Indeed, venerable sir. So this again is the problem with sensual pleasures. Having seen this thus, and actually with proper wisdom, he avoids the equanimity that is diversified based on diversity. So he avoids the consequence of a pleasure, which is to get bored, to become apathetic, etc. And he develops the equanimity, which is based on meditation. Now, when he does that, he can eventually, of course, in the fullness of time, he moves towards full liberation. And in that way, he can begin to see how he has ended up where he has, which is to see past lives. Because of the divine eye, this clairvoyance, he can see that other beings are also moving from one realm to the next due to their ethical behavior. And then finally, at that same supreme mindfulness whose purity is beyond, is due to equanimity, realizing for himself with direct knowledge, the disciple here and now enters upon and abides in the deliverance of mind and the deliverance by wisdom that are taintless with the destruction of the old taints. Remember the old taints, the oozings. Deliverance of mind is to do with the jhana, which in pure vipassana, of course, is also when all the hindrances disappear. And deliverance of wisdom, of course, is insight. Then there's a final paragraph where this Potiliya talks about thoroughbreds. So he says, with up until now, all these monks that came from monastics that came from other teachers, we imagine them to be thoroughbreds, right? The real thing, you see. And therefore, they got food and were seated at the place and given proper respect, you see. But because he and his family thought that the bhikkhus of the Buddha were not thoroughbreds, then of course they got inferior food and were given lower places. But now that will completely turn around, because he's been convinced by the Buddha that this is the true path. And so the final paragraph is one that we see repeated throughout all the scriptures when somebody does that. Magnificent Master Gautama, magnificent Master Gautama. Master Gautama has made the Dharma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overturned, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, holding up a lamp in the dark for those who can see. I go to Master Gautama for refuge, to the Dharma, to the Sangha. From today, let Master Gautama remember me as a lay follower who has gone to him for refuge for life. So here we have another convert to the Buddha's teaching. And so it's just for us really to contemplate our lives, to remember these 8 abandonments. I'll just remind you again of this lovely little book, Pressing Out Pure Honey. You can't read it. Pressing Out Pure Honey by Sharda Rajel, in which she's gone through the whole Majjhima Nikaya and made little notes. So here, for instance, in this particular discourse, she tells us a little bit of opening, and then she tells us these 8 things: killing, stealing, false speech, malicious speech, rapacious greed, spiteful scolding, angry despair, and arrogance. And that if you if you do these things, then of course you end up blaming yourself, being rebuked by the wise, end up in unhappy destinations, and there of course the rising of the taints, the oozings, and with it vexation and fever. So keeping that in mind, we shall continue, of course, to progress along the path. And I can only hope my words have been of some assistance, and that I've not confused the issue or made it too complicated, and that you will be liberated sooner rather than later. So let's begin our practice.